I'm going to talk about some research we did with some particular Aboriginal students, but I'm also aware that for a lot of you there may not be any Aboriginal students in your schools at all. So I'm not just going to talk about Indigenous education as if there is one such thing. It could apply to, for a start, the term Indigenous we use because it's convenient, but it's really a bit of a mashing together of a whole different range of people groups. And the students I'm going to talk a little bit about are from the desert region of northern Western Australia, and they'd be quite different from saltwater people from around here. So please don't sit and think this is the recipe for Indigenous students everywhere. And in using the term Indigenous, I'm conscious that it's an abbreviation, but it's just easier than saying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students every time, if that's okay. All right? And in your school, it could apply, you can use this to think about learning with any kids really. Okay, so if you haven't got any Aboriginal kids in your school, hopefully there's still something of interest there. We'll see. Oh, that's a picture of me, by the way. I've grown this beard for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. I thought it might make me look like some sort of hipster. But I'm not willing to get the tattoos and everything to go with it, and it hasn't worked, but I just haven't shaved it off yet. So if you see me later or you want me to do something else, then I might look more like that than this. Okay, I'll just show you a little bit. This is where we did the research with these students. That's the road, and it was like that for about 120 kilometres. It was very interesting for the first 10 kilometres. And we had a hired four-wheel drive, and we were sort of going along quite slowly, me and Peter Sullivan, a good city boys, and then we just realised slowly we got faster and faster until we hit a pothole, and then we realised we went back to being city boys and went slow again. That's another part. It wasn't our car, so we didn't mind driving through it. That's the school, one of the schools we went to. That's the biggest school, by the way. This is in the Kimberley region. You know, these academics, they get to go on luxurious trips and get fancy hotels. That was my accommodation. It's called a donga. I always thought a donga was something else, but anyway, that was it. The main thing you need to note is it had an air conditioner on the end. So that's where I lived, with a little green frog in the toilet. That's another school. Anyway, so we did this project in the Kimberley, and mostly what we were doing is trying to find improved ways for kids to learn maths. And the research team, I don't know if any of those names mean anything to you. Peter Sullivan was the lead writer of the national curriculum. You might know Peter Sullivan from Victoria. And anyway. So we had this part of the thing I'm going to talk about. We had 42 different students from years 3 to 7. And they all lived in remote Aboriginal communities. So there was a few Europeans there. They were the teachers and the owner of the store. And then often in these schools, the principal would be the oldest teacher in the school, probably 25 maybe, been teaching for 2 years. And the principal did various roles like fixing kids' bikes and working with the community when the bread baking oven didn't work in the shop, and organising transport for the football team and all sorts of jobs as well. And what we did was we got one of the local teachers to work to do the interviews. And we did interviews with these kids for about 30 minutes. I'm sure that's all really interesting. So there was 2 parts to the interview. The first part, what we did was we gave them questions straight out of the NAPLAN test, which they'd all done. Compulsory that they all do the NAPLAN test. So all these kids had done the NAPLAN test. You might be surprised to know they didn't do very good. For the year 3 and 5 students, we gave them year 3 questions because they're the ones that they would have last done. And the year 6 and 7 students, we gave them the year 5 questions because this was at the start of the year, so they wouldn't have done NAPLAN this year. What we did was we put the questions one by one on a card, and we just gave them the question and asked them to give us the answer. Okay. Now in this part I'm going to show you today, we're only talking about the questions about measurement. So I took out all the others, it's only about measurement. Can you look at that question and think what might be tricky for kids living in a remote Aboriginal community about this question? True, none of them had ever seen a train except on TV. And then most likely it was a steam train incident. Anything else? Names of the stations, okay? Central, the last three didn't mean anything. The Central certainly did mean something to them. It was a football team. So this question was asking why some piece of machinery was leaving a football team. Now, most of the kids just didn't answer it because they had no idea what the question was asking them to do. If they'd seen a train, they'd certainly never seen a train station. There are trains a little bit in the Kimberley out running some, but not near where these kids were living, running mining trucks, things. You certainly wouldn't catch the train, but a lump of coal might. Okay, so I might come back to that one later. Anyway, so that was the first part. We gave them just straight NAPLAN questions. The second part, we gave them measurement only questions. So I took out all the questions that were in the NAPLAN question and then I tried to make one that was similar. And I tried to connect it to the kids' lives around their community. So for example, instead of saying how far is it to the train station, I'd say how far is it to the shop, because all these communities would have a shop. And then we tried to put manipulatives or physical objects in if we thought that was appropriate. And then if we needed to, we'd ask them, well, how did you work that out? What did you do? So a lot of you might be familiar with sort of task-based interviews if you've done first steps in maths or Count Me in Two if you're from New South Wales or Make It, any of those sorts of programs, a lot of them have got task-based interviews. And then we tried to ask some open-ended questions as well. Okay, so the same topic as the first one, the NAPLAN questions, but just we worded it a different way with 42 kids. So what did we find out? Well, first of all, funnily enough, we found out the task-based interview was a really good way of working out what kids understand about maths. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was good to find out what they learn about science or all sorts of other things as well. Well, this is no radical finding. I'm sure most of you knew that already anyway. But nevertheless, it gave us a good junket to travel up to the north of Western Australia, talk to these kids and come home, so we could come back and tell everyone that task-based interviews are good. But the second thing it really showed up was the role of context in building and fostering engagement with the kids was absolutely critical. In fact, they couldn't engage with it if the context was foreign. Now this applies obviously to these kids, but I can tell you it applies equally to the kids I've taught over the years as well. And some of these guys sitting here will be well aware. I used to teach in a program in a school and I took the kids who didn't want to be at school. So I thought, right, well, this is good. I can teach them whatever I like and I'll put it in a context that's interesting to them. So we were doing percentages. So I made up this fantastic unit about mortgages. And it was in a low SES school in Adelaide, in New Zealand. And I went over and I gave this unit, I said, kids, this is fantastic. We're going to look at mortgages. And they all go, oh. I said, no, this is really good. You're all going to have a mortgage one day. No, don't think so, sir. No. I said, well, your parents have got mortgages. No, we rent. So it was a meaningful context for me because it dominated my whole life on whether I could actually have a sandwich for dinner that night or whether I had to pay my mortgage. But for these kids, the context was completely meaningless to them. So it's not just in this case here with these Aboriginal kids where it was obvious. Context can be really important to consider. Go off on a bit of a tangent. There was a big study done in England about assessment in kids in context. And what they did was I can't remember exactly, so I'll make up something, but you'll get the gist of it. They asked these kids something like, what's 5 divided by 1.67? Almost all the kids could get it right. They asked them, but then they wanted to put it in context, because we have to do that these days, put all the word problems around it, so then that means the kids who don't read very well don't do good because they can't read. And the question was something like, cherry ripes cost $1.67, how many can I buy for $5? All the kids from the higher SES classes still got it right because they understood the literacy of tests that this isn't really about cherry ripes or shopping, it's just 5 divided by 1.67. More than half of the kids from the low SES got it wrong. And they said, well, you got the first one right when we didn't ask about cherry ripes. How come you got the second one wrong? They said, oh, sir, if you go to Coles this week, cherry ripes are on special for 99 cents. So the answer's 5. Because they actually thought the context meant something. But can you see how powerful the context is? Sometimes we're floundering around because we have to put it in some context, we make up some artificial things, and it can put their understandings astray. And it certainly made the maths here inaccessible to some of these Aboriginal kids. So you won't be surprised to know that they did markedly better on the same questions on the task-based interview than they did on the NAPLAN question. And funnily enough, they had actually far more advanced mathematical skills than the NAPLAN questions would let them say. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have NAPLAN, but I think we should be very sceptical about the results. And I'm pretty sure the Primary School Principals Association has just put out a release about the use of the NAPLAN results. Okay. So here's a typical question that was on the thing. And I gave the kids that one. And 25% of the kids got it right. And you can see the trick they're trying to put in there. Okay, a few things that put them off. First of all, it says which one has the least liquid. Okay, I think that's a nasty trick because it's just trying to make sure the kids can read. Yeah. And then the different shape, you're just trying to see which kids look and see which is the highest or lowest rather than actually using the scale. Okay. Only 25% of the kids got it right, and I'd guess about 90% of those 25% guessed. Because if you look, there's 4 options, and if you guess, even a monkey would get 25%. I'm not saying that monkey word came out as a bad example there. Then I gave them 3 solids, a cube, a cylinder and a pyramid, and said which one holds the most. And they could hold it and have a look at it. 70% of them got it correct. Incidentally, there was only a very small difference in the volumes of the 3 shapes. Okay. And they could also tell me which one held the least and why they thought this was the case. Now, without going into a long palaver about this, I just think we need to be really careful about the validity of NAPLAN assessments. They're useful for something, but you've got to realise they don't tell us lots of things, and they're skewed in all sorts of ways. Particularly for kids in areas like this who've constantly been portrayed as being dumb and bad at mathematics, when in fact some of their mathematical understandings are very advanced. So I'm not saying don't do NAPLAN, I'm just saying I think we need to be a bit more sophisticated in how we understand it. So for example, I'll give you an example question. Do you remember the question? I'm sure you memorise it. There was one, it had a map, just a simple map, and it had a hospital, I think it was here, and it said if Johnny goes out the door of building the art gallery, turns right, goes left, what building is on his right? Or something like that. Pretty easy question, really. Now I gave that to these kids here and I said to them, what's the answer? And then they all look at me like this. I say, you can tell me, what's the answer? Not one kid out of the 42 kids would answer me, not one. They'd all look at their feet. So I asked to the Aboriginal education worker who was with them, I said, look, what's going on? He said, I said, you've got to tell me, I really don't get it. So he said, well, you're a senior person and they think you're stupid. You're asking a really stupid question. So they don't want to tell you because they're not allowed to make you look stupid because you're an elder or something. So they wouldn't say anything, which is why they leave the question blank on the test. So I said to them things like, well, look, over there's a blue car. What's on the right of the blue car? And they'd go, because it's a stupid question. Because, well, not so much a blue car, but a building or something like that. I said, what's on the right of the shop? You wouldn't say, they would never say what's on the right of a shop, because they'd say, it depends what side of the building you're standing on. They would say what's north of the shop, what's south of the shop, what's east or west, or they could all tell me all those things, but they didn't answer that question because it was a stupid question to ask and they didn't want to embarrass me by telling me I was stupid. So you see, they had much more sophisticated reasoning around positioning than just left or right, but in the test they all got it wrong because they left it blank because they didn't want to make someone seem stupid. Yeah. They do use left and right, by the way, but it would be if I said if I'm holding a piece of paper, what's on the left-hand side of my piece of paper? Because the piece of paper can move around, but a building stays still. So you don't use left or right for a fixed thing. Incidentally, while we were there, they dropped about 5 boys who were about 10 years old off about 150 kilometres from the campus and just drove back because they were becoming rituals to become men or something like this. 2 days later, they turned up. Had nothing with them, but see, they don't know left from right according to NAPLAN. Okay, so another question I gave them was, I gave them 3 common objects. One was a bag of flour, one was a container of honey, treacly stuff. 3 things, it all had the weight written on them, by the way. And I just said, which one weighs the most? None of them looked at the label, they all were just hefting it, they all got it right again. Or not all of them, but a lot of them. Now, the point here is to cut a long story short, all these kids had good understandings about volume and weight and mass and these sorts of things, it's just they weren't able to do it in the test. Now, our argument isn't that necessarily these kids shouldn't do NAPLAN. If that's the mandated thing, our view is, okay, first of all, on one hand, this is an unfair assessment, but secondly, they do have the mathematical understanding, so what we need to do is help them move from where they are so they can then show their understanding on this other format. Because they do understand it. So that we didn't want to just say, oh, this is terrible, see you later. We wanted to say, how can we help these kids now actually show what they can do? So that's what I want to quickly show you now. Oh yeah, that was just the point about reading. Often the maths test at the moment is a reading test. Okay, so we talked about that one. So after that train timetable one, instead of a train timetable, I gave them the TV guide. It's just a timetable, just a different context of timetable. More complicated, more information, and I said, what's the last show on Channel 3 after 12 o'clock? Guess what? They could all work it out. So can they read a timetable? Of course they can. They clearly show it, it's just the context in this place. So what do we need to do? Not just give them the TV guide and say, oh, that's good, you can read a timetable. We then need to show them a train timetable and say, well, look, here's another sort of train timetable. You haven't seen this one before. How is it? Can you see it similar to the other one? How did you work that one out? Could you now work this one out? So it's not just enough to say this is a terrible assessment, we should never do it. They're going to do it. So how can we use it to actually make some meaningful and help them show what they can do? It's not the idea that you teach them from scratch because they already understand how to read a timetable. It's about helping them transfer it to a different context. You'd know all this, teaching kids maths. You teach them something, you do a beautiful activity in one context, you give them another context and the kids go. Because for us, we can see it's just the same thing applied a different way. But in fact, part of the teaching is showing them how to make those connections. And in my opinion, if you want to teach, the best way to help kids apply it is I would try and teach things in an applied context first, abstract the mathematics out of it, and then help them to apply it in new situations so they see it as coming in a context. And if we had more time, I can give you some examples of that. How far is it to the river? They're all along the Fitzroy River, which, if you think of river, don't think of the Nerang River, by the way. If you think of river, think of, in the dry season, nothing. You wouldn't even just walk across it. And if you think in the wet season, it's up to 200 metres wide. So, but anyway, and I said to them, how far is it to the river? This was a standard question. Every single kid said to me something like 15 minutes. 15 minutes. So on the equivalent of an assessment like a NAPLAN, they would all get it wrong. Now, if I said to you, how far is it to the Coolangatta Airport, what would you say to me? 20 minutes or half an hour, depending who's driving, depending on the traffic. All right, but normally this is a common way we tell how far. These kids had a very good understanding of how far it was to the river. They walked there nearly every day. They just didn't know it in metres. So again, when we wanted to teach them about this, we had to find, it wasn't that they didn't know how to measure the distance, they just had a different scale, and we had to help them find a parallel scale alongside it. So I'll give you an example of how we did it. Right, that's just saying that the job is not to teach. Often with these kids, what they were being taught was as if they knew nothing, when in fact they had very sophisticated understandings. The point was to help them take what they already knew and move them across to a parallel sort of understanding. The same is often true for our kids, even if they're misconceptions, by the way. You ever tried to teach kids about a half? And at the same time you cut a pizza in 2 bits, and one's this big and one's this big, and you say, who wants half? Okay, so this activity, we tried to build on what they already knew and understood and their interests in this context. And the goal we thought was in mathematics is not just to leave them in the context, but help them move towards an abstraction. That's the power of mathematics, that it is an abstraction. So we started with this. I don't know if you've heard of the Marathon Project. The project started by Robert D. Costello, I think. For those of you young ones here, he used to be a really good runner for Australia. Anyway, he started this project to try and have an Indigenous Australian in the Olympic team by the year 2016. Now, and you might have seen on the news, they take a few runners to the New York Marathon every year, and I think they're doing quite well. And you might have even seen the documentary on this it was probably on SBS or something, but it was a really interesting documentary about how these guys were training, because they were in community, some of them, and they'd have to run so many kilometres, but it was just like back and forth up and down the same street or on a dirt track, and there'd be dogs chasing them, and they could only go at certain times. And anyway, so we gave this as a context that might get them to be interested in distances. And the kids here were, if nothing else, they were mad about sport. They played AFL. I don't know if you seen. They showed me the oval. I said, "Where's the oval?" They pointed out there, and there's this dirt patch with goals at either end. I said, "Oh, there's not much grass on it." They said, "Oh, we don't like it when it gets grass on, too many prickles." Because they don't play with any boots on. They do play with a sock on, but just on the foot they kick with. Anyway, I decided I wouldn't play footy with them. But so on this context, we talked to them about, we said, "Oh, how long's a marathon?" And the kids, "How long would it take you to run a marathon?" And we tried to get them to get this idea of how big distances were. These kids were pretty familiar with big distances. All these communities travelled in every Saturday to Fitzroy's Crossing, to the only grass football field that was watered, to play football every Saturday. That's all the teams played in the one place, and then they'd all go home. So some of them were travelling 200, 300 kilometres every Saturday to play footy. And then we'd say, "How far is it?" And they'd say, "It's a long way." But they didn't say it's a very long way. They'd say, "It's a long way. It's a long way," or "It's a long way," which is how we would use the word, "It's a very long way," or "It's a very, very long way." And so we said, "Well, how far is a long way?" And then they said, "Oh, about 2 hours driving." Would it be further? But just trying to get them to feel for how far this 42 kilometres was. It wasn't very hard, by the way, because they understood big distance. So for a lot of them, halfway to Fitzroy Crossing. And then you ask if they'd run that, and they said, "No, but we've walked it." Okay, well, how far is it around the oval? How long would it take you to run around the oval? So trying to bring it. And so we timed the students, and then we measured the track, and we tried 2 laps and 4 laps and all this sort of stuff. And we're looking for lots of opportunities to convert between metres and time. How long did it take you to run 1 lap? Okay, it took me 3.5 minutes. Okay, how far is that? Oh, that's 250 metre or 400 metre or whatever it was. So we're putting the 2 scales side by side because, see, they understood the time scale, so we were trying to put the other one next to it so they could start putting them together. Because they knew how far it was in time, they just didn't have the metres label to put on it. But they needed to have the metres label to do well in the assessments that were going to be useful for them in like NAPLAN and things like that. Okay, so then we said, well, you've got to find a route around the community that's about 2 kilometres. Okay, so the next question was, how long would it take you to run 2 kilometres? They'd rather walk, by the way. How long would it take you to walk 2 kilometres? About half an hour for these kids. So how did they measure 2 kilometres? They walked something about half an hour. In fact, most of them walked 15 minutes out and 15 minutes back. You know, they're pretty smart. So how far is that? It's half an hour. No, it's not half an hour. How far is it? Oh, it's 2 kilometres. Because we're trying to get them to move from the scale they understood to the other one. And then we give them scenarios like that. Can you see we're trying to move them from these concrete experiential things towards abstraction, towards word problems and things like that. And then there's another one. Incidentally, if anyone wants all these slides, you're more than welcome to have all of them or none of them. I won't be offended if anyone wants them or doesn't want them. Okay. And then after a few of those sorts of activities, we gave them a card matching activity. Now, I've only put 3 of the cards there so you can see what I mean. There was more of them, and then I just cut them all up. You know, pretty high tech here, a table on a Word document. And the kids just had to put them together. Which ones went together? Because one of the things the kids hated doing was writing. Okay. So they could just stick them together. But they still had to do the same mathematical cognitive labour, putting each of those 4 across together. So we had about 10 different things, shuffled them up, and they just had to sort them out and put them together. And then we gave them a question like this. We gave them a few questions like this. Peter is training for a long race. He trains by running laps around his football oval. It is 500 metres around the oval. How many laps? So what we were trying to do is take them from what they understood so they could display their mathematical knowledge which they already had in the form that was acceptable on a NAPLAN test or another form that might be useful. And that way we'd given them some more power than they had before. The problem wasn't that they didn't understand the mathematics, the problem is they didn't have the particular way of doing it that was required for this thing. And in Australia it's not good enough just to say these kids are good at maths but they fail all the time when they could achieve if they were given the right teaching around it. And it's not rocket. I hope you don't think this is rocket science. It's not that difficult.
Yeah, do you reckon they converted the metres to their personal reference time, then work out the time, then convert back to the answer?
I don't know. They might have done. I'm not happy with that. If they had a paradigm case to make sense of it, and then, because you know we do this all the time. If I said to you, how heavy is this? And you got this and you go, well, I know a packet of butter's 500 grams and it's heavier than a packet of butter. So we do the same sort of thing all the time. We gave them another one which was about long jump, you know. How far do you jump? So we just got them to run up and jump. We marked it out. We just put these marks on. Oh, who's the furthest? I don't know. We don't know where. Oh, okay. So we all need to start from the. So how can we? Oh, how could you measure it? Oh, we just put lines on the ground. Okay, we're going to come back and do it again tomorrow. Oh, hang on. The lines have been gone. What are we going to do? Oh, so they all wanted to put bits of string. How long they're. Okay, so we all had the bits of string. So who's the longest? Well, okay. Oh, now the school at Yearley wants to do the same. We want to see these jumps further. We're going to have a sports day, but it's too far to go. How can we tell who's the longest? Oh, just send them the piece of string, sir. What if we can't? And so we move them towards using a scale for measuring distance that way as well. So just simple examples. Now these is about some Aboriginal kids' particular context in Western Australia in the Kimberley. But it could be kids anywhere. And they might not have trouble with this, but there'll be something else which they can help them make the connections. So yes, I've already said we should be sceptical about the results, but the main point for anyone, teaching any maths anywhere, we really need to start with where the kids are at. And again, it's not rocket science. I haven't got a rocket science degree. It's just trying to understand where they're at, what they're interested in, and move on from that.